Let me bring Dan in. Dan, can you just give us an overview of your own work and unique interest in remote viewing? I understand you've been able to prove it scientifically.
Well, I knew Targ at Stanford Research, and of course, Elizabeth Rauscher was my best buddy, but my actual origins here was when Ed Wilson, research director of Monroe Institute, called me and said that Bob Monroe was afraid, after he showed golden ratio binaurals was the most powerful trigger. And of course, at that time, they didn't know the physics that was imploding into longitudinal coherence interferometry, which is the only actual real physics, and explains, for example, why sunrise, sunset, and magnetic lines cross specifically enable. And it was only later then we developed the world's most powerful bliss binaural, flameinmind.com, which, of course, the board members of Monroe Institute, Chris Kleinput and Claude Swanson, they were deeply into, but Laurie Monroe just couldn't get it through her head that she had to learn what longitudinal interferometry was, or she'd never be able to optimize. And now we have the frequency signature, of course, Therify.net, imploding plasma, and we trigger lucid dreams regularly. And I have the slides here prepared. And then now recently we measured the electrical moment in the brainwaves of Jean-Charles Moyen when his lucid dream became a portal and bilocation. And we have proven clearly the physics of what that bilocation is, which is the implosion into a longitudinal wave coherently propelled, what Gurdjieff would call assembling the light body or the rainbow light body. It's actually a field of longitudinal EMF coherence. And we have the frequency signatures now, and we regularly trigger lucid dreams. And at greater brainwave densities, that is the beginning of the only definition of what a Stargate is.
Very good. So before we invite you to share your screen, do you have any pointed questions for Dale Graff?
Well, does he know what coherent longitudinal interferometry is?
I have to confess, I have not heard of that term before.
Well,
you're not the only one, Dale. Interferometry. I mean, it sounds.
I know what that is, but not the term, the way he's using it.
Well, it's been called scalar or torsional, but that's the incorrect term. Coherent longitudinal EMF is driven through the Planck threshold, which is how the frequency signature is tuned. And that's the physics of what a Stargate is clearly. And my film on that has been seen by about 50,000 people with Elena Danaan on the physics of what a Stargate is.
But the torsional word, I think, goes back to some Soviet work I've been.
That's right, exactly. The American psychotronics, they called it scalar, and the Russians called it torsional. And it wasn't a bad term. It's basically caduceus, but now we learn to optimize the frequency signature, what that is, of how you implode the transverse into coherent longitudinal propagation. And that's what was called the rainbow light body. And that's the coherence that you take with you when you lucid dream. And that also defines where you can lucid dream and look at your body from outside your body if you know where the longitudinal node is, explaining why sunrise and sunset work and magnetic line crosses work, and tuning the brainwave frequencies to optimize.
So Dan, share your screen. So, and I want to bring David in after you've done your brain dump here.
Oh, great. Okay. So I'm just going to share just a couple little slides here. Lucid brain. Share. Here we go. So this is Jean. Do you see my screen here?
Yep.
Okay. So that's Jean-Charles Moyen, probably the world's most famous secret space program survivor, French. And this is the measurement of his brain waves here when his recurrent lucid dream became a portal and bilocation in Stargate with witnesses. He went to the beach, came back with sand between his toes, and there were witnesses multiple times. And then we told him how to measure flameinmind.com. And you see the alpha to gamma cascade in the brain waves, 3 different measures here. The green is alpha here around 12 hertz, and the gamma is up here on top around 40 to 50 hertz. And the cascade has golden ratio, which are in blue, and octave harmonics, which are in pink. Basically, it's a tetracube embedded in a pent. And that implosive ladder, caduceus, is called phase conjugation. And that's basically how you implode. If you look here, this is the side view of that caduceus cascade, which is converting the transverse EMF on the left into longitudinal EMF coherence on the right, sometimes incorrectly called scalar. And that tuning here is how the Therify works and how we built the world's most powerful bliss binaural. If you take the actual equation for phase conjugation, implosion, and negentropy, Planck times golden ratio, you get in blue here. Maybe this is a bit too small to see. Let me blow it up a little bit. But in green on the bottom, 7.83, 14, 20, you see the Schumann harmonics, and you see the phase lock to the brainwave harmonics. This is an intense bliss experience here in brainwaves on the left, but that's mine, but I didn't climb all the way to the gamma. However, when you get there, then you have children able to see without their eyes, and you have when lucid dreams become a portal and a Stargate. So this is the actual equation harmonics here in pink. And below, these are the frequencies Antoine Priory used to heal thousands of cancers documented by the French government. So that is the physics of what's called Origin of Negentropy, the title of my book, and how Therify works. So we took those frequencies, we modulated in plasma, therify.net, doing rejuvenation commercially in 25 countries, and we regularly trigger lucid dreaming. Now I'm going to turn off my sharing here for a moment.
Very good.
And so what happens is the out-of-body experience is precipitated when the aura is centripetal enough and implosive enough to convert the transverse EMF coherence into longitudinal projective interferometry, basically the rainbow light body or the Kesjan body, Gurdjieff called it. And that coherence specifically is measurable when the brain waves implode, and that density is what propagates the coherence. And so the ability, when kids see without their eyes, they see through a little vortex portal inside their head, and that plasma donut is what you take with you when you lucid dream, and when it's at higher amplitudes, that's called a Stargate.
Very good.
It was the speed of light in his experiment was almost 1.618 times the traditional speed of light, and the means to measure it back in those days was not that accurate. So I propose it was it was 1 times 1.618, and that's interesting, Dan. If you look at the data,
feedback. Let's get some feedback.
Yeah, okay.
That's an interesting point here, Dan. What's that giggle for?
Well, we said when the dominant velocity faster than light was measured at 1.618 times c, the speed of light, our theory of gravity would then be proven, as Tom Bearden says, longitudinal waves are gravity waves. And then Professor Raymond Chow measured it, indeed, between 1.5 to 1.7. So, yeah, exactly. And I think David's making a very good point, how you feel. The point I would make is, as in The 9 Faces of Christ, the famous book, determining how many organs of perception you take with you in your lucid dream, and there was a sequence of exercises in that book, is literally the amount of coherence you generate in what was called the higher being body or the Kesjan body, which now we know exactly what that is. That is the coherence in the longitudinal field. So you can study how to grow your aura to that longitudinal coherence by measurement. And now we know the exact frequency signature. And last thought, the reason Tesla screwed up wireless power globally was because A, he didn't have the frequency signature. He didn't have my equation, Planck times Golden ratio. And B, he didn't know where the nodes were, the cross points, which are, of course, the dodecacosa Earth grids, which are the longitudinal nodes to enable global wireless power distribution. For example, Tesla chose 60 cycle, which was a huge mistake. The frequency at which the voltage required to stop the heart is lowest, whereas 50 hertz is required to grow carbon and all kinds of full range and most common healing frequency for cancer. So we've answered the question.
Right, indeed. Well, maybe
I think, if I may, that there was a pretty well documented episode when the government dragged Ingo Swann to remote view the backside of the moon, and he came back scared out of his wits and wrote the book. Previously, Ingo Swann was the one who demonstrated he could light a thermistor, literally a flame, with his mind. We called it flameinmind.com, the brainwave, for that reason. So he lit a flame with his mind through a Faraday cage at a distance. And now we know the frequency signature. We know the physics, why the longitudinal coherence could go through that Faraday cage. And by the way, Rick Hasson, who was one of the producers of Stargate, was the coordinator at Gaia TV when I helped found Gaia TV. And as producing Stargate, the letters they used on the ring of the Stargate were the shadows of the Ophanian-Enochian alphabet. And we know exactly the physics, because that was hypercube plasma donut symmetry to implode and project longitudinal. So the physics has all confirmed the stories.
Well, activating Merkaba or, correspond or dovetail with this conversation?
Well, tetracubic symmetry, which is what Merkaba refers to poetically, tetracubic symmetry is essential to stabilizing. It's literally freezing like a crystal. And then on that ladder of coherence, it is possible to put the pent onto the hex. You tilt your head 32 degrees, the chin angle of the Sphinx, and you rotate, and the cube embeds 5 spin into dodeca, and it goes from hex to pent. And then implosion is possible, and then Stargate is possible. And if you don't do the last step, you're susceptible to parasites because you're not imploding. But I wanted to say something previous to this about non-locality. Actually, non-locality here is a name for inhabiting the array. And where you are centripetal in the array is where you have an organ of perception, because you implode, and that sorting at the phase conjugate point is the touch point to the stillness of the longitudinal array. So specifically, the distance to which you can propagate is the wavelength of the longest wave of coherence in that array. So, for example, you're inhabiting an array right now. It's called Indra's net, the synapses in your brain. When you inhabit a larger array and you get centripetal enough, then you don't need your body anymore. So the nature of the array is the point. And that array is a longitudinal coherence array. Dodeca Cosa Earth grid is just the beginning. But the fact that golden ratio is the dominant geometry of all stellar mechanics and gravity stabilization is a big clue.
Very
that actually fits the physics very well, that in fact the lucidity is the coherence of the plasma field. So of course if you move, you lose coupling with that plasma field. That fits too. Just one quick thought. I think what might be missing here in the conversation, I totally agree with Dave that to access the stillness, you don't really want to go anywhere. You're in the center point. However, a counterpoint to that is that the proven role of yearning, as in the Sufi charge the battery of yearning, the opposite of Buddhism, eliminate desire. When Jean Charles Moyen's lucid dream turned into a portal, it was intense yearning. And the direction the survivors of Philadelphia Montauk went to was always where they were yearning. So in effect, the focus, the ability to yearn also allows you to steer, as in the way the time chair dodeca.
Can you define yearning in this context, Dan? Is that to do with unresolved psycho-emotional imprints?
Well, in 2 cases mentioned here, it was simply yearning for your lover, which is what John Charles Moyen went to. And actually in the book 9 Faces of Christ, the same story. The way he learned to take more organs of perception with him on his lucid dream was he needed to see and feel and touch his lover. So therefore, yearning is pretty simple in some ways.
Very interesting. Fascinating. Dan, what do you say to that?
Well, the future self, remember, when time reversal was first measured, it was only a name for return to order. You could only time reverse toward order. And so then we learned that time was merely a name for rotation rate, actually. And but more interesting here, when I first studied lucid dreaming, which I don't think I'm that good at, it was because I had been studying death. And it's well known, the sequence of geometries you see at the moment of death, lattice, cobweb, tunnel, spiral, the Heinrich Kluwe form constants. We have the pictures, goldenmean.info/immortality. We learned that the reason you're seeing that, if death is successful, is because death is a compression event, that implosion is what allows you to propagate longitudinally, and explains why the skill to lucid dream predicts whether you'll take memory through death, because it's the same physics. That's how I got interested in lucid dreaming, that what's actually propagating at the moment. That's why the place of death is so critical. And because your ability to embed in the array is determined by, you don't see these plasma ghosts coming out of bodies very often in hospitals, but if somebody dies in nature, then you see it's because longitudinal coherence is possible. So the study of death is what got me to studying lucid dreaming, basically. And actually what we're calling heaven or plains of Sharon, we've talked many times, is that longitudinal array.
That's like something from the Bardo. Did you
breakdown on what you believe deja vu is? Dan, start with you.
Well, we wrote the physics quite well. The physics of coincidence is charge coupling. It's very simple. Once you know that charge rotation spin rate is the only definition of time. And interesting, when they said Osiris is coming back into Venus, it was because of the pent orbit. It's embeddable. That's why she's there. And Lyra similarly. So the psychology fits the physics here. Last thought. When Lawrence Gardner proved that the plains of Sharon, the Israeli name for heaven, was the unpacked electron orbitals of monoatomic gold, it was good physics because, in fact, phase conjugate dielectric infinite orbital radiance, literally fractality, is the only possible definition of heaven. Hey, Ave. So that also defines the possibility of coincidence.
Handbags. which surface all around the world on these petroglyphs and relief statues from Mesopotamia and Sumeria and so on. This is a recurrent theme. What exactly are we looking at, Dan?
Well, I heard two major theories. One, of course, Sitchin's Sumerian name for computer disk, ME, the Me stones, from which we get a word Me Asa Uru, measurement. So they were holding their computer disk, which determined what they could do and what limited most of their activities. And the other hypothesis was this was holding their gold powder, their ormes. Both make some sense because in both cases, this was their immortality recipe. And their Shem unto the Lord was literally to produce a age-reversing electric field. So the Shem was actually, they call it altar in the church, but how to build that Shem was on the computer disk, and the Shem was a plasma field to reduce aging.
Very interesting. David?
Okay, so I've seen this. Of course, I've seen this on Ancient Aliens. Whatever we know from biblical studies that there were devices, and the devices could be a Holy of Holies temple, which originally was 10 by 10 by 10 cubits. And then we also know that.
Well, it's just that those who were contracting remote viewing for the government, did they ever learn any of the physics to optimize, namely, if you're at a magnetic line cross point, if you're at sunrise or sunset, anything that creates longitudinal embedding enables lucid dreaming and remote viewing? Did they know?
No, we did not know.